Darkness and Sweetie Belle chapter name. Stop the hurt. Apple Bloom and Scootaloo were waiting for me at the top of our tree house. I ascended the ramp. The right side of my chest hurt every time I tried to fill my lungs. Shallow breaths were all that I could master. Anything more than that and I would be clenching in pain. My red scratched skin, under strands of hair, was turning more bluish each time I looked at it. If it were only that, I could just bite my teeth together and work through the pain, but my horn was what really worried me. Whenever I touched it, my whole body jerked from the hurt that followed. It also felt loose, but I wasn't sure that it actually was. I tried to check if it wiggled, but the triggered pain made the whole world seem loose. I decided to stop touching myself. My friends were already waiting for me at the entrance of our clubhouse. I continued limping toward the top of the ramp. Apple Bloom pointed her hoof at my bruise. "Does it still hurt?" I stopped in my tracks before I came within the reach of her hoof. I knew she wasn't going to touch my big scratch, but the mere thought of something getting near it scared me. I was in too much pain already. I couldn't handle anymore. I tried nodding at her, but the pain in the base of my horn made me stop moving my head. "And your horn, is it any better?" asked Apple Bloom, pointing her foreleg to it. I sucked some air through my clenched teeth, then shook my head very slowly. "Can you still use magic?" Apple Bloom put down her leg. "I don't know. Just thinking about it makes it hurt." The edges of my mouth were drifting down. "What if I'll never be able to use magic again?" "Hug?" she asked. I felt a smile forming on my lips. I decided not to use the hurtful nod anymore. Instead I used words. "Yes, please." She brushed her cheek against my mane, then leaned her head on the back side of my neck. Lifting up both of her forelegs, she embraced me. I lifted my forehoof and brushed against her foreleg while snuggling my head against her mane. As she leaned in closer, she brushed against my scratched skin. The pain rushed through me, but I fought against it. I clenched my teeth. I didn't want to interrupt the hug. Despite the extra pain it caused, the hug made me feel so much better inside. I didn't even feel like crying anymore, even though I had every right to. It's okay to cry when you're hurt as I was. It's just a scratch. Scootaloo sighed. It'll heal up in no time. You won't even see it in a few days. She walked inside our tree house. I ended my hug and stepped with all my forepaws on the floor of the balcony. "Thank you, Apple Bloom." I smiled at her. She smiled back and waved me with her forehoof to the clubhouse as she walked backward toward the entrance. I looked through the door to Scootaloo. "What about my horn?" "What about it?" "You just bumped it on a tree branch." "I'm sure it'll be fine," Scootaloo said. Apple Bloom joined her inside. "Can you please look at it?" I walked to Scootaloo and slowly bowed my head. "Is it still whole?" "Yes, Sweetie Belle, it's perfectly." "Wait." Scootaloo leaned closer. "What is it?" "Tell me." "Well, there's a crack on the backside of it." Scootaloo waved her hoof up and down above her head, "but they could have been there before." I gasped. "A crack?" I limped to Apple Bloom. "Is there a crack?" She bit her lower lip and leaned in. I kneeled before her. "What, you don't believe me?" Scootaloo stood up on her hind legs, placing her forehooves on her hips. "There is a crack, Sweetie Belle." Apple Bloom put her hoof on my shoulder. "But it's a small one. You couldn't even see it from a distance." Scootaloo laid down near the podium and sighed. "It really hurts when I jerk it." "What if it's something serious?" Apple Bloom tapped me on my shoulder. "These things heal themselves. Even if they wouldn't, you could always ask Zecora for help. See?" She opened her mouth and tapped on the front tooth with her hoof. "Good as new." "Oh, I hope you're right." I sighed and looked out the window. Not even half of the day had passed, and my mind was already drifting off as if it was already time to go to bed. My legs were pulling me down more than they were holding me up. Apple Bloom sat down within the circle that marked our special thinking spot. I didn't feel like relaxing. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't want to loosen my clenched muscles. They were keeping my mind focused on something other than hurting. I stood in the middle of our clubhouse. There wasn't much to say. We failed. Again. Scootaloo turned over to observe the ceiling while Apple Bloom placed her forehoof under her chin and leaned on it. The silence was getting uncomfortable. Self-pity was taking over me again. I was pretty sure they were already tired of my whining. And so was I. I spoke up. "I think we're doing it wrong." "Doing what wrong, Sweetie Belle?" Apple Bloom stood up. I slowly turned back to her. The crusading. Scootaloo rolled over. What makes you say that? Flapping her wings, she scrambled to her hooves. I wasn't sure how to put it into words. Our ideas. They are wrong. Scootaloo walked to the apple bloom, stood up on her hind legs and turned the lamp placed above the thinking spot on and off repeatedly. I slowly bowed down my head, so I wouldn't get dizzy from looking at the flashing light. We're trying out everything we can think of, but nothing works. The floorboard I was standing on seemed to be out of place. It was a little bit raised compared to the neighboring planks. I thumped on it with my forehooves and it slid back into place. Scootaloo stopped playing with the lamp and dropped down on all four hooves. Apple Bloom's eyelids fluttered open as she turned to me. What we need is a plan, I said. Do you have a plan, Sweetie Belle? Scootaloo asked. Well, sort of. I usually went along with their ideas, but the last attempt was really painful. My coat was muddy and dirty. With all the scratches, I looked as if I had been clawed by a timber wolf. There had to be a better way for getting cutie marks, a less hurtful way. Let's hear your plan. Apple Bloom leaned forward. Our plan should be to find the plan and not just do the first thing that one of us thinks of, I replied. Even if that wouldn't work, it might at least keep us away from any potential hurt for some time. And how do you plan to find the plan? Scootaloo looked up toward the lamp again. I don't know. I looked at Scootaloo. That's why we should ask some MLP. Scootaloo waved her foreleg at me. We've already done that. We've asked Applejack, and Fluttershy, and they didn't tell us anything useful. They didn't tell us anything useful. Apple Bloom summed up Scootaloo's point. And Rarity, and even the awesome Rainbow Dash. And Rarity, and even the awesome Rainbow Dash. Scootaloo kept talking, ignoring Apple Bloom's interruption. She sat down and tilted her head as she adored the picture of Rainbow Dash hanging on the wall. I know, but what if we asked the wrong ponies? That didn't come out the way I thought in my head. Scootaloo stood up and looked at me, lowering her eyebrows. Rainbow Dash is not a wrong pony. What I meant was, they weren't even trying to get their cutie marks. What if they all just got lucky somehow? Maybe we should ask more ponies how they got theirs, instead of just forcing our cutie marks all the time. Sighing, I glanced at Scootaloo, focusing on her wings. Not all of us could use those to slow down our falls. Some of us didn't have them. I looked at Apple Bloom for support. We might find some MLP that tried something that worked. Then we could also try it and maybe it would work for us too. I smiled at them. What I just said almost sounded like it made sense. This idea seemed a lot safer, and I felt pretty sure it wouldn't end up in aches, pain, and scratches, as was the case with that day's crusade. Not to mention all the tree sap, pine needles, and leaves. I liked getting dirty just as much as the next foal, but getting covered with the stuff on a daily basis gets old after a while. I can make a list of ponies we can talk to. Apple Bloom stood up and slid closer an inkwell, a quill, and several sheets of paper with her hooves. So, who do you want to interview? She picked up the quill with her snout, dunked it in ink, and leaned over the paper. In our clubhouse we always kept writing equipment at the ready. In case we had a brainstorm of ideas, we could write them all down, before we forgot them. Think big if you want to make it big. That's what Rarity had told me. And I did want a big cutie mark. We interview every pony, I announced. Apple Bloom's quill zigzagged from her opened mouth to the paper lying on the floor. Scootaloo raised her eyebrows at me and started cleaning her ears with her hoof. Every pony? Apple Bloom asked. I moved my head in an up and down motion to imitate a nod. My horn only slightly hurt when I did that. But that will take forever. Scootaloo waved both of her forelegs at me. And most of the grown-ups aren't nearly as cool as Rainbow Dash. What if I get bored? She gasped and shook her body. It won't take forever if we get right to it, I said. Apple Bloom nodded. Fine, sighed Scootaloo. I wedged the spiral-bound notebook, several quills, and 2 sealed inkwells into my saddlebag. I used my hooves and didn't even attempt to use magic. It was harder, but at least it wasn't as painful as charging my horn could be. Apple Bloom picked up her quill and notebook. She placed them in her saddlebags along with a sealed inkwell. Scootaloo slowly walked to our stash of writing equipment. Most of it were leftovers from our journalism days. Just as she was about to pick up a quill, she stopped. She shook off her saddlebag, then kicked it back into a corner of the clubhouse. Apple Bloom and I raised our eyebrows as we looked at her. What? I'm sure I'll remember if they say anything important. She acted somewhat defensive, as if taking notes was something that uncool ponies did. As I stepped out of our clubhouse, the warm spring breeze, heavy with the scent of flowers and hay, blew through my mane. Sun rays reflected from my few patches of coat that weren't muddy. I felt like an adventurer about to set off on a quest of exotic cultures and wondrous ancient discoveries. Unlike with our recent hazards, I felt completely safe with this project of mine. I smiled and turned back to them. Come on. Let's do something right for a change. Limping, I descended down the ramp. As I reached the ground, Scootaloo jabbed me gently in a fairly healthy spot of my torso. So, where do you want to start? We should start at the edge of Ponyville and work our way through it. Why don't we start in the middle? There are more ponies in the center, said Scootaloo. Because it'll be easier to keep track of ponies we've already interviewed. The mischievous smile graced my face. Unless you want to interview the same ponies over and over again. Scootaloo gave me a blank stare. Doug. She shook her head. And no, thank you. She turned to Apple Bloom. Do you think we should bring some snacks with us? Apple Bloom's stomach grumbled. I gave a smug grin and turned to Scootaloo as I pointed my foreleg to Apple Bloom's tummy. I think that was a yes. Scootaloo walked back up the ramp. I turned to Apple Bloom. She was blushing a little. Hug? I asked. She nodded and smiled. I reached out for her with both my forehooves and embraced her. Scootaloo sighed from the top of the ramp. Can you two stop hugging each other all the time? It's getting old.